Hi, Dr. Rosamond. Pleasure to talk to you today. Could you briefly introduce yourself and perhaps something you're working on recently?
Sure, thanks so much for having me. My name is Maddy Rosamond, and I did a PhD in Earth and Environmental Sciences here at the University of Waterloo almost 10 years ago now. I did a little bit of postdocing and then really liked teaching. So now I'm in a teaching stream faculty job, which just means like I teach undergraduate classes and I don't do a lot of research anymore. I do have like undergraduate students who do like a thesis project with me. So my background is actually streams and rivers. So my PhD was on greenhouse gas productions in rivers. So rivers, when water is flowing, there's sediment at the bottom of them. And in that sediment, there often live little bacteria. And they are great at reducing pollution and sometimes making greenhouse gases as a byproduct of some of those processes. And we were looking at nitrous oxide and methane, which are two greenhouse gases, not the most significant greenhouse gases for global warming, like that's CO2, but fairly significant. And they also last a long time in the atmosphere. So those are produced by microbes that live in conditions with no oxygen. So in the Grand River, which is like the river near Waterloo, it had a time in its history when I was doing my PhD. In some areas, the water would almost go completely no dissolved oxygen at night. And the reason for that was really interesting. Like when I met my PhD supervisor, she kind of blew my mind about like how this happened. It's because there's so many plants in the river. And so during the day, they're photosynthesizing. At night, when the sun goes down, they stop photosynthesizing. And so there's less oxygen coming into the water, but there's still respiration. So there's still oxygen being used up. So that makes this crazy 24-hour curve in the oxygen. It goes super high in the day, like way above saturation. And then at night, it like plummets. So this was a huge problem for the fish in the river because fish use dissolved oxygen. They get it, from the water, like through their gills. And there were parts of the river that would be almost like zero oxygen. So they had to like swim up a creek or something. And then when that happens, like all the microbes change what they're doing too. So suddenly the anaerobic microbes really kick in because there's no oxygen left. And so they do denitrification, which is a process that makes nitrous oxide. They do methane production, which produces methane. And so we're seeing these huge spikes in the greenhouse gases at night in these rivers in the summer when it was the growing season. So that was like fascinating to me. Like I had no idea there would be this like daily pattern in those processes. And then to finish that PhD, I did work on phosphorus, which is another common pollutant in freshwaters, especially here in Ontario. We have a lot of agriculture in our area. So we get a lot of phosphorus from fertilizers, goes into the river, and then algae just eat it up. It's a nutrient for them. So they're super happy to have more phosphorus. And then sometimes they cause these algae blooms and they die and the oxygen gets used up as they decay. And you can get these low oxygen problems. So we have some concerns in the Great Lakes here that there's algae blooms that seem to be related to phosphorus. So we were trying to figure that out. So since then, I've been teaching a wetlands class, and so I've got a little more interested in wetlands, which wasn't my original specialty, but they're so fascinating for climate change. So I thought you guys might be interested in like chatting a little bit about them. Unfortunately, my background is not like BC policy, so I was trying to figure out how wetlands are protected and regulated in BC, and I didn't get too far on that. So you may know a little bit more than me. The story in Ontario is like kind of depressing right now. Like we don't have great wetland protection. It's kind of, we're going through a phase where they're kind of trying to remove some of it, unfortunately, under the guise of like building more homes because like parts of BC, we have like crazy high housing prices. And so our provincial government thinks the solution is like reduce or make it easier for developers to build on land in various places, and so remove protections for certain kinds of like habitat and stuff. You don't want to build a house on a wetland generally because it's wet and it's not going to hold your house up very well, but that doesn't seem to enter into the conversation too much. So yeah, so I tend to like teach wetlands and we talk about climate change a lot. I have some facts because I tend to forget them in between teaching the class. So we can go kind of anywhere. I'm not sure what you guys are like specifically interested in, or if you have a couple questions queued up, we can start there.
Yeah, sure. So we were probably going to go into like just some very general things about wetlands and their impacts on environments later as well. Not going to touch too much about like, for example, how the provincial government is dealing with wetlands because we
That's
know
good.
that you're
Yeah.
currently not based in BC, and that's totally fine. But just like I guess a small question to kind of take away from this a little bit.
Sure,
This
yeah.
might be a little bit personal, but some of the students watching may be interested in pursuing environmental sciences as like a potential major or just entering this field. So why did
Mhm.
you choose this path of work?
Oh, great question. So I think a lot of students, so actually my undergrad degree was Earth and Environmental Sciences. And so Earth Sciences was like geology. And so depending on the university, many of them have like an Earth Science department, but it may be kind of differently organized. So for example, at UBC, there's like more oceanography. So sometimes it's more just more geology, or it's like the environmental sciences are added, which makes sense because they all interact, right? And then Waterloo's a weird one where we have Earth and Environmental Sciences, and then we also have a faculty of environment. And so they do some of the same kind of physical processes. There are people there who do like science, physical research, but they also like deal with policy and like, more global issues and those kind of things. So you could end up in like many different pathways to kind of do what I do. But I started off in my undergrad thinking I really liked biology, like more specifically ecology, being outside, animals kind of stuff. And I remember I went to McMaster University, which has like a common science first year, which is kind of smart because many, many students change their degree, right? Like they think they want to be an engineer, then they get there and they're like, oh no. They think they want to be an ecologist. In my case, they don't like it. And so at least if you have a common science year, that's easy to switch within science. It's still kind of a pain if you switch outside. And McMaster's a medical school, so a lot of people want to be doctors, and then maybe they realize partway through they don't actually want to be a doctor. So I was taking biology, and I had to memorize a lot of things. And I don't know if high school is the same, but like back in my day, there was a lot of like memorizing the epinephrine cycle and like memorizing the Krebs cycle, and I was just like, why? Like I did it in high school. I remember memorizing the Krebs cycle, but I just like was not interested in the epinephrine cycle. Like that was my limit. And I was like, I could just look that up. Like, why am I memorizing that for a test? And then I had taken like a geology class just as like a science elective. And I always liked fossils as a kid. So I like liked the idea of rocks and looking for fossils at the beach and stuff. But I didn't know a lot about geology, but it was just like seemed like a fun class. And it was a really great class they had in first year. So I think a lot of us end up somewhere because we have a great experience, right? You have a great high school teacher who like really has so much passion for some topic. You have a great college or university professor. You have a great internship. Like you have something that like goes really well and that people have a lot of passion. So they had a really well organized first year class. We were in lecture hall learning about rocks, but then we did a field day. McMaster's in Hamilton in Ontario, and it has a big cliff called the Escarpment, Niagara Escarpment. And so you can, there's various places you can like climb. There's stairs. You can go up and down the cliff and you can see the different layers of rock. It's sedimentary rock. And I just like love that. And there was one where it was sandstone and there was ripples in the sandstone, just like you see on the beach today. And they're like, yeah, this was like an ancient beach, right? And so we're seeing that exact same process like preserved in the rocks. So then I was like, I'm switching. So I did sort of an undergrad kind of more focused on sedimentary rocks, but I did really like the more like geochemistry side of it. So that's what I would call myself, like a geochemist, looking at how to apply chemistry into the natural world, which is super fun to me. Like I liked chemistry, but I found like the lab bench chemistry a bit boring. I didn't really love the lab techniques, and just like the pure chemistry of like mix, titrate the acid or whatever. I was like, boring. Obviously, they teach you that to like build your skill towards something more interesting. But just because I only took some basic chemistry, I never really got that far. But just seeing how chemistry is applied in the real world, I thought was like so much, just for me personally, so much more interesting. So yeah, so I just did an undergrad in earth science. I would say for earth sciences and environmental science, we get a lot of students switching in first, second year university because not too many high schools, at least in Ontario, have much exposure to earth and environmental science. Like somewhere along the way in science class, you're probably talking about climate change. In geography, you'll talk about like, mountain building and river patterns and whatever, but you don't really see it all in one place. So most students don't really think of it as a program to take. So many people are like me, like they were starting off in something else and they liked it and they switched in. So hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, for sure. No, I also don't have any like environmental science classes in school, mostly just
Yeah,
chemistry. So that's definitely an interesting
or
path to,
bio, right? So you'll get
yeah.
little bits of it here and there, but it's not pulled out together in like one place. We actually have a course in there's like some course in high school that's called like Earth System Science, and like nobody teaches it, right? Because if you have a geology degree to be a teacher, you need certain specialties, right? So like my partner is a high school teacher, so he has a physics degree, so he has enough physics and math, he can teach physics and math, right, from his undergrad degree. But if you had a geology degree, like that would only be the one course that would qualify you for. So that wouldn't be, you could probably do other stuff, but you'd have to sort of justify how you have the skills to teach high school. So there's just not a lot of people who are high school teachers who would be able to teach it. So I think they teach it online occasionally, but it's not like in every school for sure.
For sure.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. That's really helpful for the students watching as well. But I wanted to also go back to the wetlands that we were discussing
Yeah,
in
yeah.
terms of like what you're researching currently as well. So, could you kind of explain and preface why like wetlands are kind of important for climate change?
Oh, what
And
a great question.
yeah,
Yeah, so wetlands, like the definition of a wetland is an area that's wet with water in the soil for enough time that the soil actually changes chemically and that you get plants and animals that are adapted to those conditions. So some areas, they're just wet a little bit of the year, so maybe they wouldn't count. But most people would, if you say wetland, would maybe picture like a shallow, pond kind of situation with like grasses or some sort of vegetation growing up through it. In BC, you guys would have the salt marshes, right, on the coast in some areas. So, so there's different kinds of wetlands. So sometimes when you generalize about their role, like depending on the kind you have, they're a little bit different. But in general, they're like amazing carbon capture machines. So, so they do other things for climate, and we can, if we have time, we can get into like they do a lot of flood control and they do a lot of water quality purification, which isn't really for climate change, but is super important. But maybe the number one thing they'd be known for is just carbon capture. So the reason for that is like an interesting chemistry thing again, or biology thing again with the saturated soil. So when soil is totally saturated with water, so like every little pore space in there has water in it, which is what happens in a wetland. Uh, Oxygen is not super soluble in water. So there's like 21% oxygen in this atmosphere here. In water, when it's saturated with when the water's like in equilibrium with the atmosphere, it's like 12 parts per million oxygen. So it's just super low. So what that means is like any little aerobic microbes in the soil run out of oxygen pretty quickly. So in wetland soils, maybe the top like fraction of a millimeter has a bit of oxygen if it's in contact with the atmosphere. And then really, really quickly, within millimeters, it's down to basically zero oxygen. So there's a whole bunch of consequences of that. And one is that aerobic respiration is super fast. So if there is some oxygen and some organic carbon sitting around and a bit of water, some happy microbe is going to eat that and like make a ton of energy and be super happy. Just like we eat sugar, right? It's like it's the same process we do to eat food. But once there's no oxygen, those things either they die off or some of them actually switch pathways and they can survive in both oxygen and no oxygen, which is really cool. But once you get into the anaerobic environment, anaerobic microbes are so slow. They don't get as much energy. If you think about it in chemistry, they don't get as much energy per mole of organic carbon as a respiration with oxygen. So they just like live their whole lives real slow. Like they get a little tiny bit of energy and they like maybe grow, divide or whatever. And that process is just like orders of like at least an order of magnitude slower. So that means that like a lot of that organic carbon when the soil's wet doesn't get decomposed. Like if you put organic carbon in your garden in soil that gets oxygen, over a couple of years, like that organic carbon, like your compost, it's going to decay, right? And end up back as CO2 in the atmosphere. But if that soil is totally saturated, a lot of that carbon never degrades. There's a little bit of decomposition, but it's just like so slow. So over time, as plants are dying on that wetland, a little bit of that plant material breaks down, but a lot of it doesn't. And so many wetlands just have like meters and meters of organic rich soil that's storing all that carbon, right? So one of the numbers I wrote down, because I often forget the exact number, out of all the land surface on the world, wetlands are about 3% globally. So actually, I looked up BC, it's like 5% because deserts don't have a lot of wetlands, right? So the global average is lower. And they store about 20 to 30% of all the soil carbon. So they have a huge fraction of the carbon that's in soils, right? So drier soils just don't have as much proportionally. So when you add that up globally, it's like quite a significant fraction of carbon capture. And then, of course, what do people like to do? Sometimes in certain areas, we like to get rid of wetlands because we don't think they're that productive. So historically, in BC and Ontario and like all over North America and Europe, like 90-ish% of wetlands have been removed in areas where people settle a lot. So in northern BC and northern Ontario, it's high. There's way more wetlands preserved because there's just not as many people there. But in like the Fraser Delta or like southern Ontario, where there's agriculture, 100 years ago, people were just removing them so they could farm bigger areas, right? And like they didn't know, they didn't know about carbon capture. So like that just made the most sense to them at that time. There's still wetland loss ongoing in Canada and around the world. So we still have net wetland loss because, you know, every year people are clearing them out to either put in a house or, you know, do building or agriculture or forestry or mining, right? All sorts of different land use changes. So that's one of like the many problems we're trying to deal with climate change is like protecting wetlands because they're just such amazing carbon capture machines. And if we're able to keep them wet, like they do great. If we dry them out, as soon as we dry them out and there's oxygen in that soil, the microbes do their thing and they like get rid of the organic stuff that's stored, the organic molecules that are storing the carbon in there. So yeah, that was my fun fact. 3% of the land surface and 20 to 30% of the carbon. I actually have some organic soil. Do you want me to like show it on the camera? So my props from class here.
Yeah, sure.
So, okay, so there's different kinds of wetlands. So the ones that store the most carbon are called peatlands, and I'm not sure if you guys would have heard of those, but they're the ones that peat is like organic soil that's basically all just made of plants that hasn't decomposed. So bogs and fens, if you've heard of those terms, are types of peatlands. And this is, so if you ever have gardened or you like house plants, you may have bought peat moss to put in your garden, which is just the dried moss that lives in whatever, you know, wetland that was taken out of. In Canada, the genus we have a lot is called sphagnum moss. And they're just like a really simple moss. They're often like this big. They like damp environments. And they will accumulate, you know, over thousands of years in a wetland, they will accumulate like many meters of organic soil, which is called peat. So when they're dried out, they maybe look kind of like this. This is some here. You can kind of see this is like the top. This is like the top of the plant here, they kind of look like a little pom-pom. They're super light and fluffy. So people like them for adding to soil or whatever to hold water and to like make the soil lighter. So this was from a wetland lab. Since I don't have a wetland lab, I kindly asked one of the professors in geography, and he was very nice. So if you core down into a peatland, like this is like the more fresh stuff that someone's dried. Unfortunately, I don't have any live ones to show you. When you core down into like a organic rich peatland, you get like a little core that looks like this. If it's a little bit, oh yeah, it smells a bit moldy now. If it's a little bit more decomposed, like it will compact and get kind of smaller particles. So you can see it's like darker and it's like the particles are smaller. And this is just the shape. The reason it's a circle is like they drilled it out with like a big drill out of this specific peatland. I don't know if they labeled it, but I think it's from Northern Ontario. So as long as you keep this stuff wet, the wetland has a high water table. This will stay with like very little decomposition for like thousands of years and just store so much carbon. The other kind of wetland we have don't have those peat soils. They have like normal mineral soils, which is like the soil in your garden, with just a little bit more organic content. So like your typical like swamp or marsh around here is normally just, if you looked at the soil, you'd see a lot of mineral grains, and then you would also see organic material. And I don't think it's going to show on camera very well. I have some from like my local marsh that's near my house. It just kind of looks like garden soil with like a bit more organic content. So these organic wetlands tend to store more carbon. and they cover huge areas in Canada. So we have in the boreal forest, we have a lot of peatland. So Canada's kind of a high carbon storage country for that reason, all those wetlands. And then the other thing to think about is like, probably some of the listeners are like, well, like, don't forests store a lot of carbon because they have huge trees, and the wetlands often have kind of small, these are pretty small little moss plants. Yeah, so globally, there's probably more carbon stored in forests because the trees are so big, and forests cover such a huge area of the earth. So in terms of climate change, like definitely planting trees and reforesting areas is super important. But the forests tend to have kind of a shorter cycle for the carbon cycle, for the how long they store carbon, which is cool. Because if you are from BC, you know, unfortunately, forest fires come through, right? And so on average, maybe a forest will burn every 100 years or so, 50 years, there's like some range. So that carbon is going to go back into the atmosphere after that 50 years, right? And then the forest is going to regrow. But because wetlands are wet, if a forest fire goes over them, they'll often not lose a lot of carbon because the soil's wet. They may burn like a little bit at the top, but they don't necessarily burn all the carbon that's like meters deep there. So they have the advantage that way. So the longer term carbon storage is much longer for the wetlands compared to the forests. I hope that was comprehensive. We can also talk about flooding if you have flood protection, if you guys are interested in that.
Yes, perfect. That's actually just what I was gonna ask. Like, I know there was some flooding in like I think Manitoba and northern Alberta in the past year. Not sure if like they had a lot of like wetlands or like things to mitigate that in terms of the geographic location, stuff like that. So how would you say like wetlands would basically mitigate and contribute to like flood control?
Yeah, they're often really good at that. It sort of depends on their shape. So a lot of wetlands, especially if they have the mineral soil, because these organic soil ones, when they're bogged, they tend to build up over time because they're growing, they're not degrading the peat, right? And so the plants keep growing on top. So some of these organic wetlands, like bogs, they form a dome. So if they form a dome, the water is just going to like run off it. So they don't do a lot for flood control. But a lot of other wetlands are kind of a depression, right? It's like a little pond in, an area, or like the areas beside rivers, the floodplain. And so those can store quite a bit of water. They often have a little bit of a natural depression shape. So it kind of depends where you are in the landscape. Southern Manitoba tends to get a lot of floods, and that is pretty hard to prevent because if you've ever been there, it's so flat. Like it's amazingly fun. Remember, I did my undergrad thesis project in Yellowstone Park, and we drove out that way. So we crossed into the States in like Saskatchewan. So it was just like amazing to me because I had been by as a kid at some point on a road trip with my parents, but I had not like retained how flat it is around Winnipeg. And that's actually because it used to be a lake. So when the glaciers were melting, at one point, well, pretty much all of Canada was under like a kilometer or two of ice during the last ice age. And that ice had to melt at some point, right? And so as it melted, it made these like giant lakes. And so the Great Lakes were way bigger. And then that whole Winnipeg like prairie area was under this huge lake called Lake Agassiz. And so it's just like this incredibly flat lake bottom where like the only elevation is like where they build up a highway. You can just see it so flat. So that's super hard to prevent floods, right? Because the rivers are in like a little valley that they've carved out, but it's not super big. And so once they flood, the water's going really far. Traditionally, like before people were farming in that area, pre-colonization, I guess, there were little natural wetlands on that landscape, and they were often kind of small. They call them prairie potholes, and they're often kind of round shaped, not necessarily super big. And they also were from the glaciers. They were actually little blocks of ice that broke off the glacier, got covered in sediment, and eventually melted. And then when they melted, they kind of slumped into like a round shape. So those would actually store a little bit of water. They can't really do too much when there's like a huge flood on like what's the one that goes through Winnipeg, the Red River, because there's just no capacity. There's some capacity to deal with flooding, but not a ton. However, the fact that we've removed so many in the prairies, I think, does add up to some loss of like flood protection. So yeah, wetlands are a really nice way to do flood protection because if they're already there, they tend to store some water during high water levels. And a lot of the ways that people try to engineer solutions to deal with flooding If they fail, they can be really bad. So it's pretty common, you know, to put like artificial levees around rivers, like just like hills basically on both sides of the river. So then if the water level goes up, it's like going to hit the hill and it won't go over. But if those break, then that can be really problematic. So it's fine if they work. Hurricane Katrina in the US was an example of when they had levees around the Mississippi River and it flooded because of a big hurricane, and huge areas of that city were like wiped out. That city is like basically right at sea level or below sometimes. So that didn't work out so well. Whereas like with a wetland, they sort of naturally engineer themselves over time to be able to deal with those kind of things. Like you could have like an area of a wetland that washes out, but over time it'll tend to kind of grow back in a way that would prevent, you know, those kind of failures in the same way.
Okay,
I don't know.
yeah, no worries. Thank you so much for all of that amazing insight. I know we've been talking a lot about like ways that wetland are able to, I guess, mitigate a lot of the impacts of climate change. But I also noted that previously you mentioned a little bit about wetland destruction through things like infrastructure development. So we're wondering if that destruction is becoming more common and how it will impact climate change through released carbon if the destruction continues.
Yeah, that's such a great question. So I think the answer is a little bit different, Canada versus globally. So Canada, we didn't really have a lot of wetland. We didn't really think, I would say generally in like North America and Europe, we didn't really think about wetland protection much, or didn't think they were worth saving until maybe about the 1970s. And so since the 1970s, there's been a lot more consciousness about how useful they are for us, right? And also that they're really important habitat for so many animals and plants. So, and yeah, fish, I guess, is the animals. So we've actually probably put in more regulations since then. Canada has kind of like spotty rules about wetlands. If you own land and you have a wetland on it, depending what province you're in and what the local rules are, you probably have a lot of freedom to get rid of that wetland if you want. Like there's probably nothing really stopping you from ripping it out and putting in whatever you want to do because it's your land. There's different rules for like federal land, right? And whether if it's like important fish habitat or migratory bird habitat or endangered species habitat, then it can be protected. But we don't really have one overarching rule for like protecting wetlands in Canada across the board. So that's often kind of cited as a complaint. But the Canadian system is like super patchy, depends on the province and even like the municipality sometimes what the rules are. An interesting contrast to that is the US, where they have wetland protection in their part of their Clean Water Act, also kind of from the 70s. But the way they do it is like if you're going to remove a wetland, like to say put in a housing development, you have to like create a new wetland somewhere else, or you have to like restore a wetland. And it's supposed to be like a 1-to-1 ratio. So if you take out like 1 hectare, you've got to like put back in 1 hectare somewhere else. So that has created a whole industry of people like restoring and creating wetlands. But it's actually really hard. So a lot of the time they do it, but it doesn't really stick. It doesn't like go so well. It doesn't persist long term. And so they're still kind of out of wetland. Like they've maybe kind of made one, but it's either it dries out or like it doesn't quite function like a normal natural wetland that's had a lot of time to evolve. So there's kind of challenges that way. So I would say in North America, we've at least slowed our wetland degradation, I think, since the 1970s, just because of more public awareness and like some policy changes. But we're still losing wetlands. And there's other parts of the world where people are really, really, really taking wetlands down pretty fast. And a great example of that is Indonesia. So Indonesia has forests, and a lot of them are also wetlands. They're forested wetlands. And there's often quite a lot of peat or organic soil stored there. So they're like really rich in carbon storage. And they're getting removed often for agriculture. So a lot of the times they're cleared, and I think probably the most common crop would be palm oil. So palm oil is just like a cooking oil or like an oil used for food. And, you know, they're palms, so they grow in the same kind of environment as like the wetland rainforest that was there before. But that does remove a lot of carbon. And then, so there's land use changes like that, which are pretty significant. And then the other thing is just wildfires. And I know you guys have a lot of experience with that in BC. There have been, you know, forest fires that do also burn some of the peat, depending on, or the organic soil, depending how hot it gets. Sometimes they do really well if it's like not too crazy of a fire and they're wet. They can it often won't burn too badly, but sometimes it does. There's been really bad forest fires in like Siberia the last couple of years. And I don't think they always get a lot of press. Like every time I teach that wetlands class, I'm like, I'll look up the Siberia forest fires. And there was like another one in the summer just every year. Siberia is a big area. So like somewhere in there, there's going to be a forest fire. I think they're just natural. As far as I know, they're not started by people. They're like just, lightning strikes or something starting the fires. But probably because of climate change, it's getting a little drier there. There's a little more thunderstorm activity and lightning. So there's a little more potential for these forest fires to go through. And they'll burn forests and they'll also burn wetlands in some situations. So that does also release quite a bit of carbon. So I think the international effort, like with the UN is like very aware that wetlands are very important for climate change, and they always make recommendations in their assessment reports for climate change. There's definitely interest in preserving wetlands, but it's always so hard in developing countries, right? Because people are removing things for economic reasons. Like they're trying to feed their families, they're trying to lift people out of poverty. Maybe not in a super sustainable way, but in a way that's immediately available to them, right? So it's pretty tricky as a developed country for us to be like, well, don't do that, because they're trying to send their kids to school or whatever, trying to like bring some jobs into a town, trying to make some money doing palm oil agriculture. So I don't know that we've made a lot of progress in stopping wetland protection, but wetland removal, but the UN does a lot of outreach too. So they do a lot of like wetland education kind of stuff, right? Trying to get people to be aware of like what wetlands do for us.
Okay, that sounds really cool, honestly. Like I didn't know there were like so much discussion surrounding wetlands, honestly, before this interview. So like that's really great to consider as well. Um,
Great, yeah.
This is sort of a separate question, but very relevant to like I guess more of the US these days. Considering the new developments of the Willow project have passed, do you have any like insight on that and the impacts it may have on our environment as a whole?
Yeah, so
Yeah.
essentially what happened was Biden recently passed what's called the Willow Project, which is this oil mining like project
Oh,
now in Alaska.
in
So I know
Alaska.
that there's a lot of like issues surrounding how much carbon it's going to release, especially I think. So that's what people are mainly like debating over right now, but it has been
Right.
passed, unfortunately.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I saw it on the news and I missed what it was called. So yeah, that's a great question. It actually does relate to wetlands a lot. So in the Arctic, there's actually a lot of wetland soil. It's not all wetlands up there. And if you think of the tundra, you often kind of think it's like rocky and dry. Like that's kind of what I pictured. But there are areas that are wetland soils and they're also frozen. So they have a lot of permafrost. And so that's where the Arctic story gets really interesting. So permafrost is any soil that's frozen solid for at least 2 years. So what that means is like if you think of an Arctic soil, if this is like your Arctic soil column here, the top part is going to thaw in the summer, right? So the Arctic does have a short, but summer where it's more than 0 degrees Celsius. So the little, I don't know, maybe a couple like tens of centimeters might thaw out. And then below that, the soil is actually a pretty good insulator. So it's still cold down there. So below that little top surface part, it's going to be frozen year round if it's cold enough in that area. And so some of those soils are really rich in organics. They're wetland soils. And so in the summer, you'll get little wetland plants growing in the Arctic, and then they'll freeze over in the winter. And so over the years, they'll accumulate that carbon. And as long as that's frozen, nothing's going to happen to that carbon. Like there's a tiny, tiny few microbes who can survive and will actually use up carbon and respire below 0 degrees, but very few of them. So we consider that carbon like basically stored. As the climate's warming, then we're starting to see more permafrost melting. And so if that permafrost is in organic soils, then as soon as it's melted, right, and it's exposed to oxygen, if it's close enough to the surface, it's going to start decaying. And there was actually like in Alaska, there was a study like more almost about 10 years ago, I want to say it was 2012, that was looking at that and being like, oh, this could be a huge, what they call positive feedback, where as warming happens, we're thawing permafrost. The permafrost is going to degrade and release CO2, and that's going to cause more warming, and that's going to cause more melting, and therefore more permafrost degradation, and it's going to be like a positive feedback where it just keeps building. And so they called that idea the carbon bomb, and that was like a big concern. And then this will get back into mining eventually, but right now it's about climate change. And then so eventually some other studies came along and they were like, okay, thank goodness, it's probably not going to be like this catastrophic, very fast growing exponential problem, because the organic matter in this organic soil is not super easy to break down. So not only is it like in wet areas where like there's not a lot of oxygen, it's also just organic molecules that aren't super tasty to microbes. So the way we say that in biology is labile, which is like a stupid biology word. But like, just imagine it's not a delicious hamburger or a delicious sushi. It's just like some kale. Like there's some nutrients in kale, but like not a lot, right? So you're going to be chewing a lot and you're not going to get a lot of calories. So microbes will slowly chew away at that kale, but they're not making a lot of CO2 very fast. So that was kind of the good news out of that Arctic story, because there was this real panic that we would get into this positive feedback with climate change that we just couldn't stop. And there's a lot of the Arctic soils, a lot of the wetland soils that have a lot of carbon, like a fair amount of them are in permafrost areas. I forget the percentage. So there's that concern, you know, as you're developing oil and gas, you're also moving heavy vehicles around the terrain, and you may have to dewater the soil, like pump the water out. Not usually for oil, like usually they just drill under and get the oil out. But if you're doing other mining, like open pit mining, you have to pump that water. So that lowers the water table too, right? So there's lots of examples for like Ontario mining around the James Bay area. There's a huge potential deposit called what's it called? The Ring of Fire, and it has a whole bunch of like rare earth elements that would be really good for like solar panels. Like we need these kind of things. They're kind of hard to find. There's not a lot of them. They're in this area full of wetlands, and they have to pump. They can't mine through water, right? So they have to pump out the groundwater quite deep often, depending how deep the mine goes. And that dewaters the wetlands around it. So when you pump out groundwater, you get like a little cone shape like this, where you're pumping here, but the water's rushing in from other areas, so you draw down the sides as well. So that's a concern. Yeah, and then just like the more oil you develop, right, the more CO2 you're going to put in the atmosphere. Depending who you talk to about climate change, it's interesting to me because I'm more like from the science field, so I think about like how greenhouse gases get produced. But to talk to policy people, or you know, people who are like in the UN trying to like actually make a change about climate emissions, CO2 emissions, depending who you talk to, they often say, well, it kind of doesn't matter. It's like you need to reduce the demand, right? It doesn't really matter if you reduce the supply of oil, because like somebody else in the world who has oil will probably increase their supply to match the demand. So if they didn't, I guess this is the argument for Alaska, if they didn't bother developing the Alaska oil fields, you know, Saudi Arabia or Venezuela or somebody who has oil will just put out more because they're going to make money off it for now. The only way they're not going to put out more is if there's no demand, right? So the logic goes. I mean, you can also play with demand, right? If they make it super expensive, then people are going to drop demand as well. So I think we're in a really interesting time where we're just starting to see things like electric cars take way off. Like I would say in the last couple of years, I see so many more electric cars and hybrids than I've ever seen before on the road. I don't know how people afford them. They're so expensive, but like they're making it work, right? And there's cheaper, it's not just Teslas, right? There's cheaper options now that are a bit more affordable. But I just think like so many more, you know, middle-class common people can afford or are putting the investment into electric cars. So that's driving down some demand on the oil. There's still a lot of demand for oil, right? So globally, we're not at that point where we don't need to develop these oil sources. Or natural gas, like BC is doing liquid natural gas now, right? That's the new thing. So it's like such an interesting time to me. And I want to be hopeful for everybody in your generation and my generation too, that like, I do think we're going to get through this. Like we're going to figure out some solutions for climate. We're going to see some messes. Like there's going to be more forest fires. There's going to be more climate refugees, I think, you know, people moving out of places that aren't so hospitable anymore. And then probably conflicts, right, that are resulting from resource issues. But on the other hand, like we've made so much progress in the and the tech side. And I think we've all sort of finally come around to the idea that we have to do something. Like, I was in grad school like 15 years ago, and we all knew this stuff scientifically, but there just wasn't quite the same like public awareness or public acceptance. Like there was public stuff about climate change in like the early 2005 kind of era, 2010. But like there were also so many people who were fighting it, right? And there was money from big oil putting out messages from oil companies that everything was fine. And this is all like, a conspiracy or whatever. I'm sure there's still people who think that, but I think the vast majority of like everyday people are much more aware about climate change now, and there's like more solutions coming down all the time. So I do want to say, I think it's going to be okay. But, the more we do now, the less we have to do later, which is always a hard sell sometimes. So the more wetlands we protect now, the less we have to deal with that carbon in the atmosphere, right? That Alaska thing is so interesting because they've been talking about developing up there for like 30, 40 years probably. It just comes and goes, depends on the president, and then someone will approve it, and then it won't happen, and then it'll go back and forth. The price of oil will change. It won't be worth it anymore. So I'm not sure it's like 100% for sure thing going to happen. But it is interesting that like it's on the table, and it has a couple different, besides just climate change, it has a couple different issues, right? Because they're going to be shipping the oil by water part of the way. So there's issues with like potential boat spills, and then there's issues with pipeline potential spills. So there's lots to talk about with that topic.
Definitely. I feel like oftentimes when we talk about climate change, we focus on like the negatives for the most part. So thank you so much for bringing up that like hopefully it's going to be okay and that there are like still solutions currently being enacted, right?
Oh yeah, so many. And like there's just always more economic incentive every day, right? Every day it's more worth it to go into that field. So, if you like environmental science, awesome. We would love to have you study with us. If you're just interested in any other field, I think it's very likely there'll be some sort of climate change aspect to that in your career, right? So if you're interested in any type of engineering, any type of like business, there's so much opportunity for, solar panel businesses, geothermal, like electric cars, just like so many things. And I think even things that don't seem like they would necessarily be related to climate change, I think you're going to be dealing with that in your career, like your whole generation. Even if it's just like supply chain issues, right? Like as things get more expensive, or there's issues with I don't know, shipping, whatever, because shipping is kind of gross bunker fuel. If you're buying paper supplies and you're importing them from a different country, like you're going to be dealing with some of those things, right? Whether directly or indirectly. So I think the more climate literacy everyone has, like that's kind of good for your career, almost no matter what your career is, maybe.
Yeah, of course. I guess then on that like idea of climate literacy and like current solutions, I know that you're currently a professor. So how are some ways that students or just youth that you're currently teaching are involved in things like wetland research and protection or just climate protection in general?
Yeah, great question. It really depends on the person. So I know a lot of people who do a ton of research about something that would have something to do with climate change. So my background was greenhouse gases, and that lab doesn't always even do greenhouse gases. They do other things as well. They do organic carbon cycling, which has greenhouse gases in it, but sometimes they just look at the dissolved organic carbon. They do nutrients, that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of that. The University of Waterloo, our Earth Science department has quite a strong groundwater program. So people look a lot at like contamination in groundwater. Groundwater is one of those resources that like probably is going to be exploited more in the future, because not everywhere is using their groundwater either for drinking water, agriculture, whatever they're using for. Because it's kind of hard to find where it is, right? You kind of gotta like drill and dig around for it. It's not so obvious compared to like a lake or a river, but it's often cleaner, and it's often a little more sheltered from the ups and downs of the climate. So if you're in Vancouver, you depend on that reservoir, right, for water. And like my sister used to live in Vancouver. There was one year where like the reservoir got dirty somehow for a couple of weeks, and like they couldn't drink the water. It maybe wasn't a couple of weeks. I feel like it's probably a few days. Otherwise, that probably would have been a problem. So people look at groundwater sustainability a lot in our department. So there's lots of research happening. And then who's the activist is really interesting to me. So because we have a faculty of environment here at Waterloo, I would say like a lot of the more sort of people who are like more involved in citizen led kind of initiatives tend to probably be more in that department. So I always felt as like sort of an environmentally minded person, although I will not say I'm the world's best person at organizing a lot of this stuff. Yeah, there's kind of like more hippies over there. And then here it's like we're outdoorsy, but like a lot of people in my department, they may have like an SUV to get to the outdoors, you know, like they're not necessarily like super green in like every aspect of their lifestyle, which is hard. I mean, to be fair, it's hard to do. So I'm kind of like maybe in the middle somewhere. So there's a broad range, and there's lots of student interest. Like I would say when I teach students, you know, everyone's very aware of climate change. I think some people are super anxious about it, or just very like, if they're not anxious, they're just like aware it's going to be a big part of their lives. And I think that's true. It's going to be a big part of all of our lives. All sorts of different aspects of it that we probably haven't thought about. So, you know, I think they want some ideas about how it works and how they can help and what they can do. They want some action. There's like lots of like clubs getting involved. I think honestly, it often like the most useful thing to do is like call your MP or your MPP or your MLA, if that's what it's called in BC, like your provincial representative, call your federal representative. Make sure you vote if you're over 18 or 18 or over. You know, like be involved in like the government side of things because they do have a lot of impact on what happens. That said, you often shout into the wind, right? So like often people are complaining to the government and the government is not too interested in their agenda. So that's, you know, that's where you can like do a lot of volunteer things. And there's so many on the ground things. And as you guys were saying, like sometimes there's so many of them, but they don't seem to do anything. So you just kind of have to know your local community, right? And there are things that have chapters around. So if like you're into the David Suzuki Foundation or whatever, they may have like a local chapter. Or like there may just be things that have sprung up by locals. And sometimes to me, those are like the most meaningful because you really feel like you're making an impact if you're like picking garbage out of a stream, you know, like I did some like trail maintenance with like the local trail people and you're like, is it going to solve climate change? Like, no, probably not. But you know, you're taking some litter out of the environment, which is good for the ecosystem for sure. You're getting outside, you're meeting people, you're building connections with people who may be doing something more in the future. Um, Things like that. So one thing that I'd be meaning to get involved in, I also have a toddler, so like, you know, I have less time than I used to. Is in my neighborhood, it's a 1960s neighborhood. So the like boulevards where like there's grass between like the sidewalk and the road are so big because that was just the style of the time. They're like, I don't know, 4 feet maybe, like they're huge. And everyone just puts grass on. Most people just put grass on them, like just plain grass. And they often have trees on them, which is nice. But I'm just thinking like in terms of like pollinators, that's such a lost opportunity just to have grass. Like you have to mow it. It's annoying. Why don't you just put some sort of like native wildflower on there? And then the bees could use it and the butterflies. You'd have a little more biodiversity and like maybe you wouldn't have to mow. Like to me, that's like a total win. So I was looking into that because I was like, I don't want to start my own local thing to do that, to encourage people to do that and like get some funding to like provide seeds or whatever for people. Um, but there are like pollinator things based out of Toronto, which is pretty close to us. So I'd like to like try to move that into Kitchener-Waterloo, which is a smaller town. So I find there's a lot of those kind of citizen-based groups. Often they're really great. Sometimes they kind of fizzle out. So you just kind of have to poke around, or like you guys make your own if you feel like there's nothing good out there. And you know, find the ones where they're pretty active and they have a good community and they actually like do stuff. So I hope that's helpful. It's not super specific though.
Yes, no, that's very helpful. And definitely it's good to see some of the more local causes contribute more to helping climate change and really making the impact into like everyday individuals. So that's really great to hear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. No, actually, if you have anything to add.
I was just thinking, I went to a talk one time and I'm trying to remember what it was about. I think it was about climate change, and it was a while ago, so the details are fuzzy. But I do remember there was someone there who like studied, I think they were from environment, like from the faculty of environment, and they had studied kind of like the psychology of how people dealt with climate change or other environmental issues. And you guys alluded to it, it can be kind of depressing, right? And sometimes when things are a bit overwhelming or depressing, we tend to just kind of shut down and like not do anything, right? Even though we have some information. And so what you said was like, we used to tell people to act local, but think global. So like have this big picture of climate change and then do something locally. And that was supposed to kind of keep you like grounded and find your community. And then she's like, even that was too much. So now we tell people act local, think local, act local. Like just really focus on the local. And I thought that was so interesting because, you know, I was doing like this research where I was like very aware of the global scale of things. Like I can't escape it in my job, right? But I think for a lot of people, you know, I have so many friends who are not in this field, like they have all sorts of other jobs and they all care about the environment and they just don't know what to do, right? Like they just don't have a sense of where to start. They don't have a lot of time. Most of them have kids because that's the age group I'm in. And they're busy with their jobs. And so they're still driving to work every day, you know, with their big car because they have kids. So they have a giant car to fill up with kids. And they're still kind of like stuck in the same patterns that, you know, many of us do. So yeah, I think that act local, think local, act local has like kind of stuck with me in terms that it really gives people something to focus on that's like could be more positive.
Yeah, that's definitely a great message to share as well. Okay, that basically wraps up all of our questions. If you have any like last words of wisdom to share, perhaps.
Well, that's so nice to ask. I just want to say it was really nice for you guys to invite me. It was really nice to meet everyone. I'm very impressed and kind of inspired. Like you guys just put something together and now you have an evergreen collective. It's so cool. So I think, yeah, you're kind of being the change you want to see in the world, which is so great. So I don't know if I have any words of wisdom. I will say maybe not everyone likes wetlands because sometimes they have mosquitoes in them and they're kind of, you know, if you walk into them without a boardwalk, they could be kind of mucky and gross. But I think in the Vancouver area, there's like great, beautiful wetlands. And I know this because when I was teaching the class online in the pandemic, I had students as like a bonus question go out and like take a picture of themselves in a wetland and like find a wetland plant and then kind of talk about the location and see if they could identify it and whatever. And because they weren't all in Ontario, like a lot of them were in Ontario, but some of them had gone home to BC and they found these like beautiful wetlands around the greater Vancouver area somewhere. So they're definitely out there. And yeah, maybe just if you're not someone who knows a lot about wetlands, but you like to be outdoors, I guess my parting advice would just be like, see if you can like find one that's on a hike and just see if you can kind of appreciate it, you know, give it a try. You don't have to like walk in there if it's wet. A lot of them, they have a boardwalk built into them if they're on a trail, just because they either have standing water or the soil's kind of just soggy all the time. So it's hard to walk on. So those are really cool. And a lot of them, you know, if they're in a popular park or something, they'll have interpretive signs. So they'll tell you about different species that live there or, you know, yeah, endangered species or like some of the carbon stuff, or they'll give you something interesting to look at.
All right, amazing. That's great. Thank you so much for joining us and all the great stuff you said. Yeah. Finn, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I just want to thank you so much for all of the like wonderful insight in which you shared. I'm sure this is very educational for all the students that are going to watch it after we post about this.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. It was really fun. All right. Well, let me know when it's posted. I'll be curious. I'm going to find it real cringy to watch myself, but you know, I'll be curious what editing magic you can do. I'm sure it'll be great.
Yeah, of course.
All right. Have a good day, guys.
Oh,
Okay, bye.
bye.